Good morning, everyone. Today, we are going to discuss a module on the village studies tradition in Indian sociology. The learning objectives of this particular module are three, namely, to appraise the students of the village studies tradition in Indian sociology in its methodological and substantive aspects. Secondly, to acquaint the students with changing conception of the village studies tradition. And thirdly, to understand the emerging trends in studying Indian villages and to understand its significance. Now, the study of the village community in India has undoubtedly been one of the single most preoccupation of sociologists and social anthropologists in Indian sociology who have been working on India. It was during the British colonial rule that India was first portrayed as a land of villages or village republics. During the 1950s and the 60s, a series of sociologists and social anthropologists, Indian as well as outsiders, produced a number of accounts of Indian society which could broadly be classified within this village studies tradition. There was something obvious about treating the village as a primary unit of Indian civilization. For a long time, the village also came to be considered as a natural entry point of understanding Indian society, Indian civilization. And the attempt was to document the different dimensions of the villages, patterns of social relations, social organization, etc. In other words, it was the ultimate signifier of authentic, native, traditional life, a place where one could see or observe real India and develop an understanding of India, the cultural values of the village society, etc. The village was not merely a place where people lived, according to Andre Bete. It had a design in which were reflected the basic values of Indian civilization. In fact, the village attained a paradigmatic status as a template of indigenous society and economy, and very often came to be projected as a shorthand for knowing and understanding society, both by the colonial rulers as well as by scholar administrators, as well as by the national intelligentsia alike. The multi-layered imaginary of the village has historically accommodated projections and writings of scholars such as Charles Metcalfe, B.H. Baden-Powell, theoreticians such as Karl Marx and Henry Sumner Maine, and even nationalist leaders such as Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and R.C. Dutt. The village has been a popular subject of research in the discipline of sociology and social anthropology because it marked a new phase in the history of social sciences. The publication, in fact, marked a new phase in the history of social sciences. And for the first time, it showed the relevance of the fieldwork based tradition using participant observation of field data. And it came to be popularly known as the field view of Indian society, in contrast to what was prevalent earlier, which was primarily a study of Indian society through scriptures, through secondary sources, which was indological in nature, which was known as the book view of Indian society. So therefore, what became a distinctive methodological tradition in Indian sociology was to carry out doctoral work by living in a village for an extended period of time, doing a village study, documenting data. And these studies were also significant because this was being undertaken at a time when independence had just been achieved, and the new self-identity of a nation like India was being formed. So therefore, in the 1950s and the 60s, the nature of village studies or accounts of India's villages was about how India was changing, how India was changing at the grassroots level. The idea that M.N. Srinivas had was these accounts would then enable the policymakers to plan for a new India in the post-independence period. The goal of the Indian nation state was to modernize. Nehru had given the call for modernization, development, industrialization, but what was happening at the grassroots level could be provided by sociologists and social anthropologists who would undertake these ground level, field based, intensive ethnographic studies of India's villages, and this would provide the much needed data and perspective to the policy planners. This is what M.N. Srinivas had envisaged as the utility of sociology and social anthropology for Indian society and for the building of policies for an independent nation state. The village studies also came to inaugurate Indian sociology's methodological intervention in an empirical direction. It helped to dismantle the colonial and nationalist mythologies and stereotypes about the village, and it shaped the methodological strategies and theoretical contours of Indian sociology. Besides, the village studies tradition has also altered the perception about Indian society outside the narrow confines of the discipline as well. At the same time, what was lacking in the village studies tradition was a theoretical understanding of the Indian village. There was an excessive concern with the documentation and description of field data, so much so that the effort to construct a theory of the village so as to fit and interpret the massive amount of data generated was still being done or was still wanting. Atal, for example, finds most of the village studies conducted, though rich in data, to be discrete, descriptive, and discipline specific. While methodological questions were raised, concepts were evolved, conceptual frameworks were formulated, but no rigorous writing on theory appeared so far. Three concepts became very central towards understanding of Indian society, and that is the village, caste, and joint family. But very little was written on the theoretical conception of the village. The village was a socio-cultural entity in the administrative categorization, but the conceptual repertoire of village studies remained limited. There are two kinds of preoccupations as far as the village study is concerned. One is this, two kinds of debates and preoccupations. One is this issue in sociology about complementarity versus conflict. In this tradition on dwelling on the complementarity, M.N. Srinivas has said that the village represented the microcosm of the larger Indian macrocosm. Although, if you were to understand India in its true sense, you would have to go and live in the village. Because the village was differentiated along lines of caste, and as we know that different castes had different occupations, there was a sense in which different castes were performed their roles in relation to the larger village society. And in the conception of Srinivas, the village was part of a larger, wider entity. The village was characterized by unity and the village had horizontal ties as well as vertical ties. But the idea that Srinivas emphasized was the idea of complementarity within the Indian villages. As opposed to Srinivas, F.G. Bailey, in his study of Bisipara, emphasized that it is not unity and reciprocity thesis which was a source of village unity, but the village was also characterized by dissension. And in this way, F.G. Bailey provides a radical critique of the unity and reciprocity thesis, stressing an alternative kind of a perception, an alternative kind of an understanding on different, on the caste traditions. Different castes had not complementary relations, but comparative and conflictual relations in India's villages. F.G. Bailey would say that the system works the way it does, not because of complementarity, but because of coercion, coercive situations which were imposed by the dominant castes. It is not easy for the castes which were at the lower levels to always conform and reciprocate to the acts by the dominant castes because they were dependent and because they were powerless. As opposed to that, Srinivas had emphasized complementarity, Srinivas had emphasized horizontal and vertical ties which held village society together. I'll go to the next debate on India's villages, which is on the issue of the myth of self-sufficiency of India's villages. In the representation of villages in India, the British had emphasized a dominant view that the villages in India were an isolated entity. The village was characterized as ageless, timeless, cesspools of backwardness and tradition, where caste relations were primary, and it was such a unit which prevented the growth of dynamic relations along class lines. And therefore, the village remained like a republic, self-sufficient, unchanging, backward, etc. So therefore, this was the dominant conception which prevailed about the village in the writings of scholar administrators, as well as in the understanding, commonsensical understanding of the nationalist leaders. But Srinivas and A.M. Shah in the 1950s showed that this idea of self-sufficiency of India's villages was nothing but a myth. And they tried to argue, in fact, that while villages had horizontal ties across villages, as reflected in ties of marriage, because village exogamy was the norm, horizontal ties also existed during times of election, because kin relations were mobilized for purposes of voting. As far as the situation within the village is concerned, it was vertical ties which governed the lives of the village, of an average person in a village, because village represented an important source of identity for its residents, and therefore different scholars placed different emphasis on how significant the village identity was for those who belonged to the village in terms of caste, in terms of locality, in terms of kinship, etc. For example, an insult to one's village would be avenged, like an insult to one, as if it was an insult to oneself or one's wife or one's family, as Srinivas found. S.C. Dubey also recognized that Indian villages varied greatly in their internal structure and organization, in their ethos and worldview, in their life ways and thought ways, and on account of a variety of factors, but he argued that the village settlement as a unit of social organization represented a solidarity which was different from that of kin, caste, and class. Each village is a distinctive entity and they possess a kind of unity which cannot be easily challenged, which is reinforced many a times through reciprocal obligations, through different kinds of accepted conventions. In fact, inside the village, the community life is characterized by economic, social, and ritual cooperation existing between different castes. People of the village can and do face the outside world as an organized, compact whole. The village in India, in the writings of the sociologists and social anthropologists, managed to challenge this idea of India's villages as an isolated village republic, as alienated, as backward, as unchanging, due to the writings of these administrators. There were many ties across the village. There was interdependence, reciprocity. Village did operate in cooperative and communitarian terms, but there were also conflicts between the landlords and the tenants, between masters and servants, between dominant castes and subservient castes, between creditors and debtors. Despite these ties, villages were hierarchical in nature. And it was this idea of inequality and not always that of community that characterized India's villages. Following this debate, let me go on to the way in which the village is changing. One of the significant representations about India's village in the recent times is that the village is no longer a site where futures can be planned. For example, in the writings of Dipankar Gupta, we find that though it exists as a space, he says that the village is shrinking as a sociological reality. Though majority of people in India live in the villages, the village leaves little impression upon the national culture today. It seems like a waiting room which one hopes to escape. This is a term used by Jonathan Parry in his study of migrant laborers working in the public sector in Bhilai steel plant. And the village is despised because of lack of electricity, a lack of modern amenity, backwardness, illiteracy, lack of civilization, etc. And people are eager to move to the city. The representation of new India, the new contexts in India, somehow seem to have bypassed the village, although it is such a significant tradition in Indian sociology. Now, what is this new context that we are talking about? One of the things that Manish Thakur does in his work on the village studies tradition is that he urges us to look at rural development as a medium or a lens through which the village is understood by the state, the conceptualization of village by the state as well as by the villagers. The preeminence of the state has resulted in a gradual loss of the defining characteristics of the village as a moral and a social universe. As a consequence, the statist understanding of the village seems to dominate the possible conceptualizations of the village. It is because the state relies on a certain image of the village and village life. It is this understanding that is dominant today. The acknowledgement that of the fact that the altered context in which the village and the state are mutually embedded in a historically transformative relationship has a definite implication on the reorientation of the village studies tradition. Rural development policies have made an enormous and decisive impact on the course of the social transformation in the Indian village during the past half a century or so. The village landscape today is dotted with the agencies of the state. The village, while transcending the differences of language, region, caste, and ethnicity, marks off a common terrain to be developed under the benign guidance of the development functionaries. What characterizes this village India is the common condition of underdevelopment at which development interventions are aimed. The characterization of a social territory in exclusive terms of underdevelopment has significant implications. Since villages are underdeveloped, they remain in the past or at best in an inadequate present, while other places have already become part of the future by virtue of being developed. As Dipankar Gupta rightly remarks, I quote, while there is the acknowledgement that rural India is changing in factual terms, yet at the conceptual level, village and villagers remain resolutely in the past. In this sense, the category of the villager functions the same way as the category of the native in anthropology. By being placed backward in time, the village typifies a social form and the villagers stand for a particular set of beliefs and values. Place and person fuse in the delineation of the essence of the village, as the village is made to stand for a kind of culture territory in relation to development. This is not to say that the village does not contest and redefine the state. The state is not only present in the village, but the village also penetrates into the state. Recent scholarship, like that of Stacy Pigg and others on development, has shown that it is not merely the supralocal sphere, such as the state, that acts on the village, but the village too appropriates the state on its own image. The village does not seem to be opaque and fixed to its inhabitants, as it appears to the policymakers and planners. However, the abstracted social map of the village, as carried forward by rural development functionaries, is then again reworked and appropriated by the villagers themselves in the process of implementation of development programs in their locale. Rural development discourse thus facilitates the spread of the larger vision of social development as more and more people lay claims to the idea of development. And sometimes the ideologies of development come in handy while segregating the village from the non-village. The ways of imagining social difference gets associated with the political uses of identity as underdeveloped or developed. Indeed, rural development then becomes a way or a medium through which villagers also start expressing themselves, their location, their identity, their historical trajectory in the course of national development. Therefore, to understand the importance of village studies in India, one has to situate or locate the village in the context of changing villages and the changing rural development policies and in the practices of social engineering. Rural development has not only been a medium in which the discourses and practices of development are conveyed to the villagers, it has also significantly shaped the ways in which inhabitants of a particular settlement conceive of themselves as belonging to a village. Now, to conclude, one would want to talk about what would be a contemporary agenda for the village studies tradition in Indian sociology. Firstly, one could approach the Indian village as an entry point to understand the history and character of the colonial forms of production of knowledge and to demonstrate how the exercise of power and accumulation of knowledge were both part of a larger colonial project. Secondly, it is important for us to see the village studies tradition also as an exposition of the way in which the nationalist leaders thought of the Indian village and wrote about the Indian village as the seat of tradition, as if it was an ideal site wherein we could find evidence of indigenous notions of democracy, of socialism, and aspects which suited their ideological palette. In this vein, studies of, say, Gandhi ashrams or Sarvodaya ashrams or Bhudan, Gramdan villages of Vinoba Bhave could be undertaken. Another ways in which the village studies could be considered as significant is to dissociate the idea of the village and the peasantry. Since the village is fast changing, can we think of the agrarian character of the village as the primary location of the peasant society? The identity of the village and the peasant community has given a particular kind of fixity to the notion of the agricultural economy. But there are far-reaching changes happening due to migration and nature of rural employment, increase in non-farm unemployment, and so on. So hence, the understanding of occupations in the context of the village, changing occupations, flow of population from the village as a site, forces us to not regard the village and peasantry as groups or categories which are fixed or dependent on each other. Lastly, one could take the more challenging task of unraveling the current instances of appropriation, romanticization, essentialization of the Indian village undertaken in the more recent conceptualizations, say for example in the writings of people like activists like Dharampal. They inform the various forms of politics and voluntarism. Many environment and alternative technology movements in India also work with the concepts of the village, and they sort of bear an inverse relation with the urban industrial tradition, urban industrial pathologies, which is associated with this city. In their writings, village is some kind of a pastoral paradise. But we know that today the village is not an entity which exists in isolation from the city, from the nation. They have to be considered together and in relation to each other. Whatever happens at the national level has a bearing on the village. Rural residents are also aware of the implication of the policies of the government on them. And hence we have farmers' movements or rumblings in the village, which in turn impact the life and trajectory of national policies in different parts of the country. Thank you.